Travis, we're so glad you could join us for this interview. Now, for those of you who don't know, Travis is currently the Acting Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Policy Analysis and Development at the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Agency, known as NTIA. In this role, Travis is responsible for helping craft U.S. government policy in areas including privacy, intermediary liability, intellectual property, emerging technology, and addressing the digital divide. Previously, Travis acted as a consultant for advocacy groups, academic institutes, and private companies on the technological details of identification technologies and the potential impacts of these technologies on privacy rights. He is an acclaimed speaker on all things privacy. First off, congratulations to the Commerce Department. We were thrilled to see that the EU's draft adequacy decision on a data privacy framework with the United States. We are getting closer and closer to having a robust mechanism to ensure streamlined data flows that will benefit industry and consumers. There are many exciting things in the pipeline this year for commerce and NTIA, and so we are excited to hear from you about predictions and expectations for the new year, given all the movement in the privacy and AI space last year. First, to recap for viewers new to the space, you did a fabulous job hosting listening sessions last year on the topic of privacy and equity. Assistant Secretary for Commerce, Alan Davidson, who also heads NTIA, commemorated MLK's legacy in beautiful remarks at Georgetown's event last week, quoting MLK and the importance of ensuring privacy protections as the right thing to do right now. He also shared high-level plans in his keynote remarks, including the announcement about an RFI to gather stakeholder feedback on privacy, equity, and civil rights this year, which will be followed by a report on the findings. Travis, thank you. Could you clarify what NTIA is looking to accomplish through the RFI? It was just issued, and some of the next steps that NTIA will take after reviewing the responses to the RFI?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks again for having me. This is really exciting and really fun, and always a pleasure to talk to you and to have the conversation. So maybe just a little bit more context setting of who we are and what we do at NTIA, at least in terms of the policy shop. So by statute, we are the president's principal advisor on telecommunication and information policy issues. And this is an interesting artifact of the fact that our office used to actually be a part of the White House and got transferred into NTIA along with spectrum management and now broadband and all these other things. But what we do is we advise on policy, right? So that doesn't mean that we're not a regulator, right? We don't create rules. We're not the people out there actually on the ground, doing the hard work of creating standards, things like that. We're policy advisors, and so in that role, we are allowed to take a big picture view and look at kind of like the ecosystem as a whole, and for that. That's kind of has informed for the past, for the entirety of NTIA's existence, our stances towards these types of issues, particularly on privacy. And so our office was responsible for the being the kind of the main drafters of the Obama-era Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. Our office was deeply involved in the Trump administration's attempts to set policy priorities on privacy. And now we're playing a similar role in this administration, helping to, be forward-leaning to help lead and guide the policy formation. Again, as advisors, we're not the ones who are, at the end of the day, making some of these decisions. And so we took the opportunity early in administration to try and looking again at this kind of bigger picture, say what are the issues that really need additional attention, right? Like, we want to pass baseline privacy, fundamental federal privacy reform. That's something that has been, that is a goal of this administration, right? As stated in the Tech Accountability Principles, the president's op-ed, and most recently, like he's mentioned, Assistant Secretary Davidson's remarks. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to drill down on some of where the rubber hits the road in terms of privacy, right? Like what are the actual issues that we're dealing with? What are the harms that we're trying to address? And for the, what we kind of came up with was, well, the harms that occur really affect marginalized and disadvantaged communities in disparate ways, and they affect them more, right? And oftentimes there are unique harms that come from flows of commercial data, even just the collection of the data that occur for these communities that don't occur for others, or are smaller and less intensely felt. And so we thought that what we would be able to do with this focus on equity and civil rights is to really focus in on what the harms are as they affect real people. And then also, take a look at some of the harms that are not generally often thought about. Like, what are some of the ways in which these communities are experiencing harms that others might not, so that can be lifted up. And one of the things we were also really hopeful in doing is that to really bring up and raise up some of the voices that hadn't been heard in these tech policy conversations as much in the past. And I think that that's something that was changing before we put out a request for comment, that civil rights groups were starting to pay attention, were starting to be involved in these conversations. But I think over the last 4 or 5 years, that's grown exponentially. And you've seen, I feel like we've seen that in the conversations around some of the recent bills being proposed. So that was kind of a lot of our goal when we started this process. We did hold those listening sessions in December. Our plan at the time was to come out with a request for comment immediately after it gets started drafting. Unfortunately, bureaucracy does what bureaucracy does, and it took us a little bit longer to get that out. But we are excited as an extension of those listening sessions to put out this request for comment, to get information from the community, from the public, from interested stakeholders in how to address, again, what the actual harms are as they actually affect people. Not saying that, marginalized and disadvantaged communities are the only ones who experience the harm, but that those harms that those communities experience are oftentimes are more acute, but are felt by others as well. And if you solve for those, then you're solving for some of these bigger picture issues as well. And so that's where we're really kind of putting this focus on, with this kind of like bigger picture focus of what are the issues that we're dealing with, what are the things that we're trying to get to, with a focus, like taking it from that granular smaller piece and then extrapolating outward.
Great. That's really insightful feedback. Thank you, Travis. You mentioned that NTIA is essentially an advisor to the president on all these issues, and our sense is that coming out of the RFI there will be a report. What are you hoping to influence in terms of concrete policy? Because the NTIA doesn't, you said, doesn't have kind of regulatory authority in this space. Are you hoping to guide the direction of other agencies, or potentially even Congress, in advancing comprehensive privacy legislation or privacy measures that are specific to different sectors? Do you have a sense of that at this point?
Sure. Well, so when we come out with the report, I'm hopeful that, the good thing about being in the position that we're in is that we get to rely on the brilliance and expertise and thought of the public and of interested stakeholders, right? So I'm really hopeful that, through this comment process, we really get to bubble up some concrete solutions, some concrete ideas of what to do and to move forward. We've got some ideas as well, but we're just a couple people in an office. We get to rely on this like broader community of thought. And so we will be coming out with our report with some real, tangible recommendations of what to do to move forward. I do think that there is, in terms of questions around Congress, as Alan said last week, the administration is supportive of federal privacy reform, and we will be, engaging in order to try and, move the ball forward with that. It's tough, right? And the details are hard. And unfortunately, the last Congress, they came really close, a lot closer than they ever had before. but there are still some difficult issues there. And I do think that we were really excited to see some of the language in those bills about civil rights protections, about trying to combat some of the ancillary harms that come from discrimination based on algorithmic decision making, things like that. But being a part of the Department of Commerce, we also want to make sure that it works, right? Like these regulations, like it doesn't help to put in place rules that people cannot follow, right? And so we're also, we do have that bigger picture perspective where we're also looking to make sure when looking at bills that are being proposed in our engagements with Congress, that these are things that businesses, individuals can also actually really use and implement and understand, and don't end up being useless, ambiguous mandates, right? And so that is part of what we're looking for out of the report. But I will say also that there is a range of activities that are going on and a range of tools that the administration has in order to kind of push the ball forward. And certainly federal privacy reform is the crown jewel of all of that. But there's also engagement that we can do with the softer, with stakeholders, potentially, having conversations with folks who are doing work in the states, or with our engagement with the independent regulators, the FTC specifically, but then also to a lesser extent, or who knows how it's going to go with the FCC if we get a fifth commissioner, right? So all of these things are areas where these conversations are happening and where the administration can be positively engaged. But it needs to be engaged in a way that's thoughtful and a way that's informed by stakeholder input and by community input.
Great. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Travis. You mentioned algorithmic decision making, and this is an area that we've seen in the past couple of years, often brought into the conversation along with privacy. Do you have, if you're able to speak to this, does NTIA have a view, or do you personally have a view about whether we should be looking at potential regulation or laws around algorithmic decision-making in combination with efforts that are focused more on privacy and the protection of personal data?
Yeah, well, it's a Venn diagram, right? Like there's overlap between the two topics, because the one of the primary uses of personal data at this point in time, right, in terms of like why the collection of all this data is a useful thing, right, is because it's being used to feed, train, and provide inputs through automated decision making, right? That's one of the key use cases of the collection and use of this data, and it's where some of the major concerns are. It's where some of the most exciting stuff is happening, right? But it's also where some of the major concerns are in terms of like the misuse of the data or use of the data that can create harms that are not intuitively understandable, right? And this is one of the things that we kind of rail against in our comment to the FTC was about the insufficiencies of notice and choice. And automated decision making really hammers it home, where what is one of the primary benefits of automated decision making is, or these types of predictive tools, is that it allows for inferences that are not necessarily rational or logical on its face, right? Liking a particular song or hovering over a particular thing, meaning that you would like something completely unrelated, but it's actually kind of predicting, it's actually, decently predictable from those things that are, unlike I click on an ad for shoes, and then all of a sudden I get more ads for shoes. That's like, okay, well, I clicked on that ad, right? That's a logical thing where you can kind of like go back and you can say, okay, I want to, please stop showing me shoe ads, right? But when you're like, clicking on, the example that everyone goes back to from over a decade now, right, is the young woman who went and like stopped buying fish at the grocery store, something like that, and then all of a sudden like was getting stuff for pregnancy tests and things like that, and they were able to discover that she was pregnant in way, for decisions and choices that, if you think about it, kind of makes sense, but are not necessarily rationally like available. And so this also gets into a secondary part of what we're getting at with the privacy, equity, and civil rights, which is a really, really hard one from the policy space. And I don't say have a good answer for it, but how do you grapple with community harms? Right, privacy tends to be something that's thought about as an individual relationship between an individual and an entity, like a corporation or government or something like that. But with the advent of these automated decisions, these profiles and things like that, oftentimes the collection of individual personal information doesn't have the negative effect on that individual, but can create kind of like larger scale assumptions, larger scale ramifications of historical disparities, and how do we combat and figure and grapple with those kind of like larger scale community harms that do arise from commercial data collection and processing of information? I don't have a really good answer for that, but that's part of it too. All that to be said, we are looking at privacy as being part of these conversations around artificial intelligence, because the data collection is a part of that. The data processing is a part of that. But there's a lot of automated decision making that has nothing to do with personal data. That is still important, right? Like the safety of a Tesla vehicle is a really important question, right? Not to call out a particular company. It's safety of an automated vehicle system, right? Like, that's an important question. It has nothing to do with personal data.
Right.
Like the transparency, the auditability, like all of that is really important. Nothing to do with personal data. And there's problems with the collection and use of data that have nothing to do with automated decision, right? Nothing to do with automated decision making. So there is an overlap, but they are not complete. And I think in terms of thinking about these things, it is helpful to think about the actual use cases, the actual harm, the actual problem, separate from kind of like the bigger, the wider, like, oh, it's just simply we have to regulate all AI, right? Or all privacy.
Yeah, no, that was a very thorough answer, and appreciate your discussion of the Venn diagram approach, because there is a lot of overlap, but there were also use cases and concerns and situations where there isn't overlap. And I think as folks who are working in public policy, it's useful for us to think about how do we approach these? Do we approach everything in a comprehensive way, or are there piecemeal approaches that we can do that kind of build on each other and address the harms that we think present a sufficient risk to society and to individuals? I'd like to close with kind of an open-ended question. Apart from receiving all the input for your RFI and producing an excellent report, what's your biggest goal this year on privacy? Something that the government can accomplish, or Congress can move forward, or NTIA can advance.
Well, I would say it's two things, and unfortunately, a creative new answer. I'm really, really excited about getting this report out, right? I'm really excited that we got the RFC out. I'm really excited about the report. Again, like, I don't want to, like, others have been thinking about this for a long time. Academics have seen the overlap between questions around civil rights and equity and privacy considerations for decades, right? Policymakers have been thinking about this, advocates have been thinking about this, but I think, we're, in terms of the federal government, actually talking through these issues. Of course, the administration came out with the blueprint for a Bill of Rights. The Obama administration came out with their big data report. But really to hone in on what some of the privacy concerns are, I think that this is a little bit new ground for a federal agency to think about. And I'm really excited about that and its possibility to influence in positive ways, in ways that are moving the ball forward, right? The overall policy conversation. I'm also really hopeful and looking forward to following through on Alan's call to try and work towards federal privacy legislation. we all have to figure out where we now stand, having the ground shifted underneath us a little bit in terms of the political landscape. But this is a matter that, at least in the previous Congress, was fairly bipartisan and could potentially see movement forward. Is it going to? I'm not sure. It is a little bit of a waiting for Godot kind of thing where, you know, everybody gets really excited, and it has not happened yet. But there's lots and lots of really, really good reasons for us to fight for this, to work towards it, and to try and get federal privacy reform on the books. And, you know, we're also, you know, the administration is supportive of the rulemaking at the FTC. But I would also note that, you know, all the bills that are being proposed also place that kind of authority at the FTC. So I think that the two things can be mutually reinforcing, with just simply the, you know, some of the benefits of bill from Congress being that you have some congressional guidance on these things and congressional authority being granted. And, you know, it's that kind of democratic process is a good thing to have as an addition to this. So so overall, those are the things that we're this year that we're looking towards. But we're also always thinking about other ways and other aspects that we can attack this problem, and that we can make Americans' lives better, right? To better protect individual privacy, to better ensure that the externalities and the harms from all these awesome, cool things and products that people are making are minimized, and the risks are mitigated, right? And properly mitigated. And really, truly, that the digital economy is one that's thriving and open and equitable for all, right? That it does not matter the color of your skin, whether you're disabled, whether you identify as LGBTQ or otherwise, that you still have the same kind of opportunities and the same ability to engage with the really cool, robust tools and services that are being provided by American companies.
Well, excuse me. Thank you for that. You know, we wholeheartedly support the drive for federal privacy legislation and are eagerly anticipating your report. We know that you're still receiving comments on the RFI, so it'll be a little bit of time, and completely echo your views on wanting to make sure that the digital economy is open and available to all, regardless of background or other traits. Travis, this has been a really illuminating conversation, and we are grateful that you were able to take time out of your busy schedule to join us today. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.